Okay, so I have my audio source attached to my rigid body. It has spatial audio turned on and it has the sine wave in it, so it sounds like this. So to start controlling this in a more dynamic way, I need to add a custom script. So to do that, there's a couple of ways. I could right click in here, go create C# script. I could do that here, create, oops, I didn't want to do that. You go create C# script there, or I can select my sphere and then just go add component, new script, and then name it something descriptive. Like in my case, I want to control the pitch, so I'll call it pitch control. And then I'll just hit create and add. And I can't have spaces here. So I do this thing where every word is capitalized to kind of, create different words. Create and add. I'll process it for a second. And now I have this pitch control script. I can double click that and it opens Visual Studio, which is my text editor for code, basically. If you've ever used something like P5.js or processing, it's a similar kind of idea here. We have a function called start, which happens once when the scene loads, when this object is first loaded. And then we have a function called update, which happens once every frame. And by default, Unity kind of sets this up with these comments that clues you into what's going on here. So in order to affect the audio source, I first have to get a reference to that audio source. So the first thing that I want to do is create a variable which will contain a reference to this audio source. Okay, a lot of lingo here, just try to stay with me. So the first thing I'm going to do is up at the top, I'll type audio source like that, and then I'll name it a source. So this is saying I'm creating a variable which is an audio source, and it's called a source. So this is empty right now. It doesn't actually contain an audio source, but I know that it can point to one potentially. So in start, I need to actually set this to be a reference to a specific audio source, because there could be many, many audio sources in our scene. So we need to know which one we're talking about specifically. So here in start, I'll say a source equals get component, and I'll use these carets, audio source. And I'll use the parentheses there. And so this is a function which searches the game object that this script is attached to for a component which is which is an audio source, excuse me. So we're saying we're making a variable called a source. It will contain an audio source. That's what all this means. And then down here, I'm saying, and a source is whichever audio source we find attached to this game object, get component audio source. You might notice this looks kind of similar to this void start and void update. It's because they're both functions. The difference is this is a function which can look for many different kinds of components. So I'm saying get component, which is an audio source. And you can think of a function as a sort of action that the script can do. And Unity has start and update kind of by default. Okay, so this is what we need to do to get a reference to our audio source. Now I can actually do something with it down in update. So I can type, if I look at my audio source in Unity, I can see I have all these different properties that I can adjust. Volume, pitch, stereo pan. I could mute it. I could change if it's looping or not. The one I'm concerned with though is pitch. So I can type a source dot pitch equals whatever. I'll set it to 1.5 to start with. So this is how I'm accessing this property, also known as a field, of my audio source. There's a lot of lingo here, but don't worry about it. Okay, so now if I hit play, this script will get a reference to this audio source component and set the pitch from 1 to 1.5. So I'll hit play and we'll hear what that sounds like. Right? If I pause it, I can see now this pitch, which was at 1, is now at 1.5. So I'm changing stuff with code. That's great. But it still isn't really responsive to anything that we've done. So if I want to make this respond to, say, the height of it in the scene, the vertical, where it is in the vertical axis, I need to get access to this transform. Now, because transforms are attached to every game object in Unity, no matter what, and it's such a useful thing, they made the transform kind of available by default. So we don't have to create a variable and do this get component thing. We can always access our transform by typing transform with a lowercase d. So if I want to get the y position, or the y component of our position, I can set this to transform.position.y. So I'm getting the position of the transform, and I'm getting the y component of the position. So if I hit save, tab back over, and hit play, now we can hear that sound is changing based on how high we are. Okay, it's already pretty fun. It's already pretty fun. Okay, so what we did in class, though, is we didn't just make it respond to the height of the sphere in the scene, but the actual speed of the sphere. So to get the velocity, we need to talk to the rigid body. But as you can see, there isn't really a public, a variable that's available to us here, a property that's available to us here in the editor that shows us the speed. So I can look at the Unity reference online and actually figure out what's going on there. So if I just search Unity documentation rigid body, it's usually the first thing that comes up. So we have this scripting reference here. And this tells us all the properties of the rigid body that we can use in code. So we can set the drag, we can freeze the rotation. I don't even know what this inertia tensor thing is about. And there's also functions. So I could add force to our rigid body. So if I smacked it with something or wanted to add an explosion force, I could do that in code. But I want to get the velocity, which is here. So the velocity vector of the rigid body represents the rate of change of the rigid body's position. So I can click on that to learn more and even see kind of an example, some example code. In this case, it looks like it has some example of how to make a character jump. The velocity vector of the rigid body represents the rate of change. And it's a vector 3, so it's a three-dimensional vector. If you remember from math class, a vector is just a group of numbers that represents usually either a velocity, which is a speed and direction, or a position. And in fact, we represent all kinds of things in Unity with vector 3s, scale, rotations, positions, and in this case, velocity. Don't get too freaked out about math, though. It's not hard what we got to do here. So back in my script, in addition to getting a reference to our audio source, I now want to get a reference to our rigid body. So I'll type rigid body, R body. So now I have a variable called R body, which I know will be a rigid body. In start, I can do R body equals get component rigid body. Now I have my reference to my rigid body. And now in update, I can access the velocity of the rigid body. So I can do that by saying, I'll make a vector 3, right? So this is our three-dimensional vector. There's also vector 2 and vector 4 in Unity, but we want the three-dimensional vector, which has x, y, and z. And I'll say R, I'll call it velocity. Say vector 3 velocity equals R body dot velocity. So I'm kind of getting the velocity out of the rigid body and saving it in this variable here so I can use it later on. You noticed I created this variable inside the update function. That means when I enter the update function, it means that this variable is only available to me inside the update function. I couldn't use this velocity inside of start, for instance. And every time we go through the update function, when we reach the end of it, we've set our pitch, it forgets about what it was. So it's kind of useful in order to kind of chunk off parts of your code. In case there's other functions, if I'm writing a more complicated script, that need to have something called velocity. I don't have to keep making different versions of velocity. Anyway, so I have velocity here. And now I can set my pitch to be equal to velocity dot magnitude. So I said that a vector can represent, well, what is the velocity? The velocity is three numbers which represent how our rigid body is moving every frame. You can think of it as kind of an arrow. It's a direction and a speed. And the magnitude is the length of the vector, the length of the arrow, or how fast it's moving. And in your math classes, you would have had to do some math to solve this, but Unity can just tell you what the magnitude of a velocity is without you having to do anything. So if I hit save, I tab back into Unity, I can see what this does right away. So now you can hear that the pitch is not dependent on the height, but on how fast we're moving. You can see it kind of reaches this like shrieking maximum pitch pretty fast as I'm moving it around. So I might want to sort of scale that down to control the pitch better. So I can create a variable that I'll use to adjust my pitch here a little bit. And I'll make it public so I can actually change it in the editor. You'll see what I mean in a second. So I'll type public float pitch scale, we'll call it. And I'll just set it to 1 by default. So a float, it's kind of the same thing as these. It's the type. And a float means a floating point number. It's just a way that we can represent decimal numbers in code. And this is the default way that Unity wants you to do it. It's called pitch scale. That's the name of our variable. I could have named it anything, but I decided to call it something descriptive like this. And it's equal to 1f. So you have to add this f after any decimal number or floating point number in order to tell Unity this is a float as opposed to other kinds of decimal numbers that you can use. So you just always add that f after your numbers, unless this is an int. If you used an int, which is an integer, only a whole number, can't be decimals, then you don't have to use it. But in our case, we want a float. And I'll do 1f. Now this public variable means that any other script and even the Unity editor can affect this value. So if I save and tab back into Unity, And I look at my script, once it's done updating it here, I should see now I have a variable that I can change in the editor. I don't have to go back into my code to change what this number is. I'll go ahead and multiply velocity.magnitude by pitch scale. And I use this asterisk as the multiplication sign in C#. So I hit Control, Save. And now I'll set this pitch scale to like 0.1 once it's done processing. There we go. I don't have to put the F in the Unity editor. For some reason, it knows that that's a float now. So if I hit play, now it's kind of a much more reasonable range.